The night air wraps you in a soft breeze as you step across Malta's ancient stones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, battles, and whispered prayers. The Mediterranean sky above glows with stars that seem older than history itself, and yet everything around you breathes with the echoes of power. You pass towering bastions built by the Knights of St. John, their walls so thick you imagine cannonballs bouncing off with an almost comical plunk. These fortresses once stood as Europe's shield against the Ottoman tide, symbols of religious zeal wrapped in stone. But as you trace your hand over their cool surface, you sense that the glory of the knights had long begun to tarnish by the late 18th century. Their order, once feared and respected, became a relic of itself, decadent, distracted, and too fond of lavish feasts while their coffers drained. Historians still argue whether their decline was due to internal corruption or simply the relentless march of modern state power, but either way they were ripe for the taking. You wander into Valletta, the capital they built, and imagine the scene in 1798 when Napoleon Bonaparte's fleet appeared on the horizon like a thundercloud. You hear the frantic clamour of bells and the uneasy murmurs of the Maltese, who at first welcomed the French after all the knights had grown arrogant and dismissive of the local population. Napoleon, with his razor-sharp intellect and restless energy, stayed only a few days, but managed to dismantle centuries of knights' privileges in a blink. He abolished feudal rights, introduced modern laws, and most controversially, targeted the church's wealth. You can almost see the monks clutching their rosaries tighter as French soldiers marched through monasteries with a cold efficiency, seizing treasures under the banner of liberty and reason. To the people, the French brought promises of reform, but their heavy-handed approach soon soured any goodwill. Moving along narrow limestone streets, you catch the scent of the sea, mingling with the faint aroma of bread from an old bakery. This is where the Maltese began to whisper among themselves, plotting resistance. Farmers, sailors, and priests all united by the shared conviction that foreign rulers, whether dressed in robes or uniforms, would not dictate their future without a fight. And so under the cover of night they reached out to another power. British ships loomed in the distance, drawn by opportunity and strategic obsession. You picture Admiral Horatio Nelson rubbing his hands together, perhaps not literally, but certainly in his mind, because Malta was the perfect stepping stone for Britain's naval dominance in the Mediterranean. By 1800, the French garrison, starved and isolated, surrendered to the British, and Malta shifted hands once again. The knights were gone, their era dissolved like mist in the sun. In their place stood an empire that prided itself on discipline and global reach. You sense the locals' cautious hope as British troops marched through the streets, less brutal than the French perhaps, but still undeniably foreign. To the Maltese, it was a trade-off: safety and stability under the Union Jack, but also a new layer of colonial rule that would shape their identity for the next century and a half. As you stand on the bastions overlooking the Grand Harbour, the waves below crash with the same rhythm they have for millennia, indifferent to the flags flying above. You realize how this small island, only a speck on the map, has always been coveted by giants, from Phoenicians and Romans to Arabs and Normans. Each left their mark, and yet Malta remained stubbornly Malta. It's almost amusing to think that such a tiny place could hold so much history in its limestone bones. You feel the weight of those layers, the tension between the old and the new, the local and the foreign. It's in this tension that Malta's independence story begins, long before any formal declaration or flag-raising ceremony. It starts here in the fading power of the knights and the restless arrival of empires where survival became an art, an identity, a shield. The wind whispers through the ramparts as if to say, watch closely. The stage is set, and Malta is not done shaking off chains just yet. The morning sun warms your face as you drift into a memory of 1798, when French sails dotted the horizon like sharp white teeth. The Mediterranean glitters, deceptively calm, masking the storm Napoleon is about to unleash on Malta. You find yourself standing amid bustling harbour-side chatter as word spreads the Knights of St. John, once fearless defenders, have allowed the French to dock without a fight. It almost feels like watching a lion bow to a fox. You sense the islanders' confusion. How could these men sworn to defend the faith surrender so easily? Historians still argue whether it was fear, bribery, or simple exhaustion that led to their capitulation. But whatever the reason, the knights packed their relics and left. You follow the French troops through Valletta's ornate gates, the click of their boots echoing against stone. They bring with them a whirlwind of reforms. You see Napoleonic officials drawing up decrees replacing old feudal codes with sleek, modern laws. They abolish the privileges of nobles/rents and proclaim equality on paper at least. To a farmer this sounds almost magical, no more oppressive feudal dues. But then your gaze catches on the churches, where soldiers confiscate gold and paintings in the name of the Republic. The people watch, fists clenched, as their sacred icons vanish into crates. The French even try to reorganize education, introducing secular schools and French language lessons, as if culture itself can be rewritten overnight. As you wander into the countryside, the mood shifts. Maltese villagers, humble yet fiercely tied to their faith, see the reforms not as liberation, but as desecration. You overhear hushed prayers turning into whispers of rebellion. Priests quietly rally their congregations, framing the French not as liberators but as godless occupiers. You picture clandestine meetings in candlelit barns where plans take shape and messages pass from hand to hand under the nose of French patrols. By 1799, those whispers roar into action. The Maltese rise up, seizing their own destiny in what feels like a David and Goliath struggle. Armed with makeshift weapons, they drive the French into fortified Valletta, where the invaders hole up, surrounded and starving. You can almost hear the cries of Viva Malta echoing through the hills as farmers, fishermen and clergy unite. Yet even in their bravery they need help, and their call reaches across the sea to Britain. You sense a certain irony here. To expel one occupier, they invite another. But to the Maltese, Britain seems the lesser evil. At least they share a common enemy in Napoleon. British ships commanded by Admiral Nelson appear on the horizon like a promise of salvation. You imagine their guns booming against French fortifications, shaking Valletta's limestone walls. Months turn into years and the siege drags on. Supplies dwindle, morale crumbles, and finally in 1800 the French garrison surrenders. The Union Jack rises over the city, fluttering in the same breeze that once carried the banners of the Knights and the tricolour of France. Standing atop the bastions, you feel the weight of a new era settling over Malta. The British arrived not as liberators in the purest sense, but as strategists who recognized the island's value as a naval jewel. They promised to respect Maltese traditions and Catholic faith, winning cautious approval from the locals. For a while, this uneasy alliance holds. After all, anything is better than French confiscations. But as the years pass, the British grip tightens. Military barracks multiply, naval docks expand, and Malta becomes an essential cog in Britain's imperial machine, especially as wars rage with France and later across the globe. Even so, you notice how the island absorbs influences without losing itself. The Maltese continue to speak their own language, celebrate their own saints, and quietly nurture their sense of identity. In a way, they play the long game, survive, adapt, and wait. You glance at the sunlit streets, the mingling of cultures and flags, and realize that under the layers of power and politics, something stronger stirs. Malta is learning from every conqueror, taking pieces of what works, discarding what doesn't, and storing strength for a day yet to come. The French storm passes, but its memory lingers like the scent of rain on warm stone. You know what's next. The British will settle in, confident in their control, unaware that the island they prize so dearly is quietly shaping the roots of its own freedom. The chains have changed, but the desire to break them remains. You stand on the rugged limestone cliffs, the waves below pounding like a drumbeat as the British flag flaps proudly against the sky. The year is 1800 and Malta has just traded one ruler for another. At first, the mood among the locals feels strangely hopeful. The British have ousted the French, and unlike the French, they respect the Maltese Catholic Church, that sacred heartbeat of island life. Priests continue to ring their bells, processions fill narrow streets, and the British wisely avoid touching what the French had clumsily desecrated. To the Maltese, this feels less like conquest and more like a cautious partnership. Britain calls Malta a protectorate, a word soft enough to soothe suspicions at least for a while. You wander into Valletta's Grand Harbour, where British sailors haul ropes and crates their red uniforms bright against the honey-coloured stone. The docks hum with activity as Malta transforms into a vital base for the Royal Navy, guarding Britain's trade routes and military interests in the Mediterranean. You can almost hear the clatter of hammers as new shipyards rise the island's economy, suddenly pulsing with the energy of imperial ambition. For many Maltese, this brings jobs and stability. Farmers sell their produce to the garrisons, artisans craft goods for officers, and the once scarred streets regain a sense of prosperity. Yet under this bustling surface there is an unspoken truth. Malta is not an equal partner but a pawn in Britain's larger game. As you stroll through a sun-dappled square, you overhear snippets of English mingling with Maltese, a language as old as the island itself. Children dart between market stalls, giggling, some already repeating English phrases they've picked up. This blending of cultures feels almost charming, but it hides a growing tension. The British administration begins to impose its own systems, legal frameworks, trade policies, and slowly the dominance of the English language in official matters. To locals, this creeping influence stirs unease, as if the essence of their identity is being nibbled at by invisible teeth. Historians still argue whether British reforms were benevolent modernization or veiled assimilation, but for the Maltese it felt like both. The 19th century unfolds with Malta firmly in Britain's grasp. You watch as the island becomes a prized jewel, especially during the Napoleonic Wars and later conflicts. British governors oversee the administration with an air of control, occasionally sprinkling in concessions to keep the locals content. Yet these governors often clash with Malta's religious leaders, particularly the Catholic Church, which remains a formidable power in its own right. You picture tense meetings where British officials, stiff in their uniforms, negotiate with bishops draped in flowing robes, each side vying to shape Malta's future. The Church resists any whiff of Protestant influence, defending its authority with the quiet strength of centuries. You stroll past the upper Baraka Gardens where cannons once roared in defense, but now sit silent, surrounded by curious tourists in a distant future. Back then, these guns were a reminder to anyone who dared challenge British control. Yet, as decades pass, the Maltese spirit refuses to be silenced. Local intellectuals inspired by European nationalist movements begin to ask questions. Why should their island be ruled from London thousands of miles away? Why should English overshadow their own tongue? The answers echo quietly at first in coffee houses and universities, but they grow louder with every generation. Meanwhile, the British view Malta less as a community and more as a fortress. Its strategic location makes it indispensable for controlling sea routes to India and beyond, especially after the Suez Canal opens in 1869. Suddenly, Malta's importance skyrockets, and with it, Britain's desire to keep the island firmly under its wing. Military barracks expand and warships line the harbour like an iron forest. The Maltese economy thrives on this presence, but at the cost of true autonomy. You sense the paradox: prosperity mixed with dependency, pride mingled with resentment. One quirky moment lingers in your mind. In 1814, under the Treaty of Paris, Malta officially becomes part of the British Empire. There's no grand battle, no dramatic flag-raising, just paperwork and signatures. For something so monumental, it almost feels anticlimactic. Yet this quiet moment locks Malta into British hands for over a century, shaping its politics, its culture, and even its cuisine, hello tea, with pastizi. By the late 1800s, whispers of reform turn into cautious demands. Maltese leaders push for greater self-government only to meet resistance from governors who prefer tight reins. The tug-of-war begins, constitutions granted, suspended, rewritten. Each concession feels like a victory, yet each setback reminds the Maltese that they are still not free. The British, ever the imperial strategists, dangle autonomy like a carrot, giving just enough to keep unrest at bay. Standing on the cliffs again, you watch the sun sink into the sea, its golden light bathing the island in warmth. The waves crash endlessly below, as they always have, indifferent to empires. You realize Malta is learning, slowly but surely, how to turn the tools of its occupiers into weapons of its own. With every law, every reform, every tension between church and crown, the island edges closer to a sense of self that no empire can fully suppress. And deep down, you know this calm won't last forever. The stage is set for the next act, where identity itself becomes the battleground. The morning light spills across the streets of Valletta as you trace your way past the towering St. John's Co-Cathedral, its baroque facade glowing like honey in the sun. The bells toll, reverberating through the city, a sound as familiar to the Maltese as the sea. It is the 19th century edging toward its close, and Malta hums with daily life, yet beneath this routine lies a simmering struggle that is not fought with cannons, but with ideas. You feel it in the air, soft but sharp, like salt carried on the breeze. Because here the battle is over language identity and who truly belongs to this island. British rule has brought infrastructure, trade and a certain order, but it has also brought policies that prick at Maltese pride. English is creeping into schools, courts and government offices, slowly nudging Italian aside as the language of power. Italian, long the language of Malta's educated elite and deeply tied to its cultural heritage, becomes a banner under which intellectuals rally. You imagine heated debates in Valletta cafes where lawyers and journalists slam fists on tables, arguing over whether Malta's soul lies with the Italian culture they cherish or the English system that now governs their lives. The ordinary people speaking Maltese in their homes and markets watch these linguistic duels with both amusement and curiosity. Historians still argue whether this language question was purely cultural or secretly political, but either way it fanned the flames of national identity. You stroll past the printing presses that clatter and hum, spitting out newspapers filled with fiery editorials. Some demand greater autonomy and defend Italian as Malta's cultural lifeline. Others lean toward Britain embracing modernization and opportunity. The press becomes the battlefield where words cut deeper than swords. The British, ever pragmatic, try to balance the scales, allowing some Italian but pushing English harder, hoping to shape the next generation. The tug-of-war tightens, and you sense how these linguistic lines start to mirror political ones, pro-Italian factions championing traditional ties to the church and heritage pro-English factions aligning with the colonial administration. Somewhere in between, the Maltese language, long dismissed by the elite, begins to stir as a powerful symbol of identity itself. In the countryside, you watch farmers carrying baskets of figs and olives, their conversations in Maltese flowing like song. To them, politics seems far away, yet their tongue carries centuries of survival. It is neither purely Arabic nor purely European, but a blend as unique as the island itself. Slowly, intellectuals begin to realize that this everyday language, the one whispered by mothers to their children, might hold the key to uniting the people beyond class or allegiance. You smile because even under colonial shadows, the Maltese spirit refuses to fade. It simply shifts, adapts, and grows stronger in quiet corners. Meanwhile, the British continue their careful dance. They grant constitutions only to revoke them when things get too heated. In 1849, limited representation is allowed in the Government Council, but it's more token than transformative. Decades later, in 1887, a new constitution brings broader representation, yet this too becomes a point of friction suspended after tensions flare. You can almost hear the exasperated sighs of governors and the defiant laughter of Maltese politicians who refuse to stay silent. The pattern repeats like a rhythm: reform, resistance, repression, and then reform again. As the century turns, you sense a quiet but growing defiance. Educated Maltese begin to form political parties, newspapers sharpen their pens, and even the church, traditionally cautious, steps into the fray to defend its influence against British secular policies. Priests preach not just from pulpits but also through schools, ensuring that Catholic identity remains unshaken. In the distance, Europe trembles with its own national awakenings, and the ripples reach this small island. Malta may be tiny, but it is part of a much larger tide, sweeping across the continent. You pause at a harbour cafe, sipping strong coffee as you watch steamships glide in and out. British officers stride with confidence, their uniforms crisp, their voices loud. Locals glance their way, some with admiration, others with barely concealed disdain. The tension is subtle but constant, like a string pulled taut. The British see Malta as a fortress, a stepping stone to the east, a base they cannot afford to lose. The Maltese see themselves as more than a fortress. They are a people with history, faith, and a voice that grows louder with every passing year. By the early 20th century, Malta is no longer just a quiet colony. It is a place where identity itself is a battlefield. The lines are drawn not by guns but by schools, newspapers, and political speeches echoing through narrow streets. You sense that something is coming, a storm that will be louder and more destructive than any debate. The next chapter will be written not just in ink, but in fire as war sweeps across the world and drags Malta into the heart of it. The island waits steady, yet restless, its spirit like the sea, calm on the surface, relentless underneath. The sky over Valletta bruises purple as sirens wail, slicing through the night. You flinch as the first distant explosions roll in like thunder and the ground trembles under your feet. It is 1940 and World War II has found Malta. The island, so small it could almost disappear under the shadow of a single bomber, becomes one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth. You wander through the narrow streets, ducking under archways as planes drone overhead, their silhouettes cutting across the moon. The British military presence, once a symbol of control, now becomes a shield for the island, is vital to Allied supply lines, a thorn in Axis plans, and both sides know it. You watch families scramble into underground shelters carved from limestone, clutching rosaries and each other. The scent of dust and fear clings to the air. Children cry, mothers whisper prayers, and fathers try to mask their terror with stoic faces. The Maltese endure this with a resilience that borders on stubbornness. Even as buildings crumble and food grows scarce, they refuse to yield. You pass by makeshift kitchens where women stir thin soups, sharing what little they have with neighbors. In these dark tunnels, you feel the heartbeat of Malta, strong, defiant, and impossibly united. Historians still argue whether it was sheer luck, British strategy, or Maltese courage that kept the island from falling. But standing here, you know it was the people's will that mattered most. Above ground, the devastation grows daily. Valletta's baroque beauty splinters under relentless air raids. The Royal Opera House is reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods lie in ruins. Yet amid this destruction, you notice something almost absurd. The Maltese keep rebuilding, even as bombs fall. Churches reopen with shattered windows, market stalls reappear in the streets, and the bells, those stubborn bells, ring through the smoke. A light joke passes from soldier to civilian. You can bomb our buildings, but you'll never bomb our tea time. Even in the darkest hours, humor survives. The British forces stationed here fight back fiercely, but they are stretched thin. Convoys bringing supplies to the island are ambushed by Axis submarines and aircraft, and soon Malta teeters on the edge of starvation. You taste the rationed bread dry and barely enough to fill a child's stomach. Yet somehow, the island holds on. Convoys like the legendary Operation Pedestal manage to break through, bringing food and fuel just when hope seems lost. Each successful arrival feels like a miracle, celebrated with cheers that echo across the harbours. In 1942, as the siege reaches its peak, King George VI awards Malta the George Cross, a decoration for valour, normally given to individuals, not entire nations. You watch as the medal is bestowed, a glint of silver against the island's battered stone. To the Maltese, this is more than an award. It is recognition of their suffering, their endurance, and their unwavering spirit. Children trace the shape of the cross on their school walls. Mothers sew its image onto makeshift banners. It becomes part of the national flag decades later, a reminder of the night skies lit with fire and the courage that burned brighter. Still, the war grinds on. Axis forces pour their fury onto this speck of land, and you wonder how it has not been erased. The answer comes in every scene. You witness a fisherman sharing his last catch, soldiers and civilians side by side, repairing a runway, overnight priests blessing both the living and the dead with equal resolve. Malta bleeds, but it never breaks. When the tide of war finally turns and the bombers fade, the island emerges scarred yet unbowed. You walk through streets littered with rubble, but alive with the sounds of rebuilding. Allied victories elsewhere reduce Malta's strategic role, but by then the island has already proven itself brave, not just in the eyes of Britain, but to the world. And with that bravery comes a quiet, growing question, whispered in kitchens, parishes, and parliament halls. If Malta can survive the might of Hitler and Mussolini, why should it remain chained to anyone at all? The war has forged something new here. The shared suffering of soldiers and civilians has erased old divisions, creating a unity stronger than any bomb shelter. You stand on a hilltop overlooking the Grand Harbour, where sunlight now dances on the water, and you feel it in the breeze. Malta has earned something more than medals. It has earned the right to decide its own fate. As peace settles, the British rebuild their bases and life resumes its rhythms, but nothing is the same. The people have seen their own strength, and once seen it, cannot be unseen. You sense that the British Empire, though still standing, has begun to wobble under the weight of countless colonies, awakening to the same realization. Malta is no exception. The stage is shifting, and soon the calls for independence will no longer be whispers, they will be demands. The air smells of salt and freedom, though no one says it aloud yet. The seeds have been planted, and the next storm will not come from the sky, but from the hearts of the Maltese themselves. The war is over, but the island does not rest. You walk through Valletta in the late 1940s, and though the bombs have stopped, the scars remain visible everywhere. Cracked walls, hollow-eyed buildings, empty lots where once stood homes. Yet life blooms defiantly among the rubble. Children kick footballs where craters used to be, and market stalls pile high with vegetables again. Malta is breathing, but its breath is different now. It carries pride, not submission. The George Cross gleaming on the flag and in the hearts of the people has become more than a medal. It is a promise, a silent declaration that Malta deserves more than being a fortress for someone else's empire. Britain, meanwhile, resumes its routines. Naval ships return to the Grand Harbour, officers stroll the bastions, and British governors speak of reconstruction and modernisation. They pour resources into rebuilding docks, repairing infrastructure, and restoring order, yet at every ribbon-cutting ceremony, the locals' applause feels polite rather than grateful. You notice it in their eyes, the awareness that their own resilience, not imperial charity, saved this island during the war. Historians still argue whether Britain truly intended to reward Malta's wartime sacrifices with greater autonomy, or whether they hoped loyalty would keep the island compliant, but the people have their own ideas. You drift through the streets at night where men gather in small groups talking in low voices. The topic is no longer survival, it is the future. Political parties reorganize, newspapers grow bolder, and debates about self-government heat up. The Labour Party, under fiery leaders, begins to argue that Malta's wartime service has earned it the right to shape its own destiny. The Nationalist Party, rooted in tradition, continues to defend Malta's cultural identity against foreign encroachment. Both sides, though bitterly divided on methods, agree on one thing: Malta must no longer remain voiceless. You step into a crowded hall where a young Dom Mintoff speaks his words sharp and electrifying. Though his true storm is still to come already, you can sense his charisma pulling people in. He talks of dignity, of economic justice, of an island that should stand as an equal rather than a subordinate. People cheer, waving their arms despite the oppressive heat. The British officials watching from the back shift, uncomfortably realizing that control is slipping not through rebellion, but through belief. Religion, as always, threads itself through Malta's politics. You watch processions under candlelight, priests carrying icons through winding streets, while crowds murmur prayers. The Catholic Church remains a powerful force, defending its role in education and governance. It supports certain parties, influences voters, and shapes the moral fabric of the nation. The British, wary of antagonizing the Church after French mistakes decades earlier, tread carefully, but tensions simmer nonetheless. Policies about schools, marriage, and public morality become battlegrounds where faith and colonial authority collide. During the 1950s, economic troubles add fuel to the fire. Malta's economy, long dependent on servicing British military needs, wavers as global shifts threaten the base's importance. Jobs tied to dockyards and naval contracts dry up, and poverty creeps back into households. This hardship strengthens the argument of those who say Malta cannot rely forever on the empire's favor. Instead, they argue it must build its own economy, one that serves its own people. You pass workshops where men labor late into the night, their hands blistered, their conversations filled with both frustration and hope. In 1947, Britain introduces a new constitution granting greater self-government. You see the excitement ripple through the island as elected representatives take their seats with pride. Yet the glow soon dims. The governor still holds significant power, and real control remains in London. The constitution becomes another compromise, a step forward, but not the leap the people crave. When the British suspend self-government in 1959 amid rising tensions, the setback hits hard. Protests erupt, workers strike, and the dream of independence becomes not just a political goal, but a necessity. Walking along the harbour, you notice something almost poetic. The same ships that once brought bombs now carry away Malta's young men seeking work abroad in Britain, Australia, Canada. They send back remittances, but also stories of freedom and opportunity that strengthen the belief that Malta should stand on its own. You overhear one worker saying with a smile, "We rebuilt this island. We can build a nation." By the early 1960s, the mood is electric. Political rallies swell in size, speeches grow sharper, and even those who once doubted independence begin to see it as inevitable. Britain, grappling with its shrinking empire, starts to listen. The negotiations become serious, and the old dynamic of ruler and ruled begins to crack. You sense that the last act is approaching, the one where Malta finally steps out from the empire's shadow. The sun dips into the sea, turning the sky orange and gold. You stand on the bastion walls, the same walls where knights once scanned the horizon for enemies, where French soldiers once braced for siege, where British sentries once patrolled. Now you see nothing but open water, endless and inviting. The air feels charged, not with fear, but with the quiet thrill of what comes next. The island, long shaped by others, is about to shape itself. The afternoon sun paints Valletta in warm shades of gold as you wander into the 1960s, a decade when the island's heartbeat quickens. You hear voices swelling in rallies, the clang of church bells and the rustle of political pamphlets fluttering in the breeze. Self-government, once a flickering candle, now burns like a torch. Malta has tasted autonomy before, but now the people want more than fragments, they want the whole of it. The debates you overhear are not about whether independence should happen, but how, when, and under what conditions. You watch the streets fill with banners as Dom Mintoff, fiery leader of the Labour Party, steps onto the political stage like a tempest in human form. Charismatic and combative, he pushes a bold vision. Malta must stand tall, modernize its economy, and cut its colonial chains. But his path is not smooth. The church, wary of his socialist leanings and fiery rhetoric, warns against him, even threatening to deny sacraments to his supporters. Priests and parishioners clash with Mintoff's loyalists, and the tension seeps into every corner of daily life. Historians still argue whether this church-state conflict weakened or strengthened the independence movement, but there's no doubt it added drama to an already fiery moment. Meanwhile, British authorities watching from their balconies and boardrooms realize their grip is loosening. The global tide is against them. Colonies from Africa to Asia are breaking away, and Malta's demands are becoming harder to ignore. Yet Britain hesitates. Strategically, the island is still invaluable, a naval fortress perched on the edge of Europe. Economically, they worry Malta will collapse without British support. and politically they fear that if they grant independence too freely, it will encourage other colonies to follow suit even faster. You can almost see the beads of sweat on governors' brows as they draft letters to London, weighing how much to concede. Walking past a dockyard, you hear workers talking about strikes and wages. Their livelihoods depend on British military contracts, but they also know this dependence is a chain. Mintoff, clever and relentless, uses this leverage. He negotiates hard with London at one point, even flirting with the idea of integrating Malta fully into the United Kingdom with equal status, only to turn away when the terms prove insulting. His strategy is bold: push Britain to either invest more in Malta's economy or grant full independence with generous aid. Some call him reckless, others call him brilliant, but everyone calls him determined. On another street, you catch snippets of conversations about another leader, George Borg Olivier, head of the Nationalist Party. Unlike Mintoff, Olivier takes a calmer, more diplomatic approach. He argues that independence can be achieved without burning bridges, that Malta can gain sovereignty while maintaining strong ties to Britain and the Commonwealth. His tone is less fiery but no less firm, and his method, negotiation rather than confrontation, slowly wins favour with those wary of Mintoff's confrontations. You smile because here in this small island, independence is not a single voice shouting, but a chorus of voices arguing, challenging, and ultimately shaping the future. By 1962, Britain signals willingness to discuss independence seriously. You watch as delegations travel back and forth between Valletta and London, the air thick with diplomacy. In Westminster halls, Malta's future is debated with the same seriousness as any great empire matter. Documents are drafted, clauses, negotiated terms debated, aid packages are promised, defence agreements drawn, and the question of neutrality versus alliances carefully considered. Every pen stroke in these talks inches Malta closer to sovereignty. One quirky but telling moment catches your attention at a rally. Someone waves both the Maltese and British flags together, a symbol of the complex relationship between colony and crown. Unlike many independence movements marked by bloodshed, Malta's struggle is unfolding through speeches, votes, and negotiations. You realize how rare this is in a century of revolutions. This island, so often a prize in others' wars, is about to win its freedom not with cannons, but with its voice. As 1963 arrives, talks gain momentum. The new constitution being drafted promises Malta not just symbolic autonomy, but real power over its own affairs. You watch as Olivier, carefully balancing tradition and progress, positions himself as the leader who can carry this through. Meanwhile, Mintoff, though outmaneuvered in this phase, remains a force to be reckoned with, ensuring that independence will not be mere words on paper but a living reality with economic substance. The Church, after fierce clashes, begins to ease its stance, realizing that opposing independence outright would alienate the faithful. Priests who once denounced political figures from the pulpit now speak of unity and reconciliation. The people too are weary of divisions. They want to step into the future as one nation, not as factions. You see this in the markets, in the harbours, in the quiet conversations between neighbours who once argued bitterly over politics but now share a common dream. The sun sets over the harbour, casting a fiery reflection on the water. British warships rest silently as if contemplating their own departure. The air feels thick with anticipation, like the pause before a curtain rises. You know what comes next. The formal negotiations will conclude and a date will be set. Soon the Union Jack will lower, not in defeat but in acknowledgement, and the Maltese flag will rise to claim its sky. The last threads of colonial rule are fraying, and independence is no longer an idea but an approaching dawn. The summer of 1964 wraps the island in heat and expectation. You walk through Valletta's narrow streets where posters of political leaders flap on walls, their faces weathered by sun and wind, but still commanding attention. Dom Mintoff's fiery presence remains in the air even as George Borg Olivier, steady and composed, takes the reins of the independence negotiations. The debates are fierce, spilling from Parliament into cafes, churches, and even kitchen tables. Independence is not a dream anymore, it is a question of timing and terms. You pause to listen to Mintoff speaking to a crowd in a packed square. His voice cuts through the air with passion, promising an independent Malta that will stand strong on its own 2 feet. He rails against economic dependence on Britain, warning that true sovereignty cannot exist without self-sufficiency. His words ripple through the crowd, igniting cheers, yet you notice older men shaking their heads, murmuring that his confrontational style risks too much. Across town, Olivier speaks with calm assurance, presenting independence not as a rupture, but as a transition. Malta, he says, can be free while remaining part of the Commonwealth, securing both dignity and stability. His softer tone appeals to those who fear chaos. The island is split yet united in one truth: the British Empire's hold is slipping. Negotiations with London intensify. You find yourself drifting into the conference rooms where Olivier sits across from British officials, the table between them heavy with documents. The talks are tense but pragmatic. Britain, already grappling with a shrinking empire and mounting costs, agrees to Malta's independence, but insists on defence agreements to keep its bases operational for a transitional period. Aid packages are promised, investments discussed, and the final details hammered out with the precision of craftsmen. You imagine the pens scratching across paper as signatures seal Malta's fate. Historians still debate whether Britain's concessions were generous or simply strategic, but here in this moment the air feels electric with possibility. Meanwhile, the streets of Malta throb with activity. The people decorate balconies with the red and white Maltese flag still bearing the George Cross, while schoolchildren rehearse songs for the upcoming celebrations. You see women hanging laundry that flutters alongside patriotic banners, their faces lit with pride. In the shipyards, workers repair vessels with renewed energy, knowing that soon they will work under their own nation's flag. In the churches, priests deliver sermons urging unity, reminding the faithful that independence is not just political, it is spiritual, cultural, and moral. Through all this, the Cold War simmers in the background. The world's superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, watch Malta's path closely, each hoping to sway the island to their side. Mintoff, clever as ever, leverages this global tension to demand better terms from Britain, hinting that Malta could align with whoever offers the best support. Britain, unwilling to lose its foothold, concedes more aid, ensuring that the young nation will have a stable launch. The negotiations become not just a local affair, but part of the wider chessboard of global politics. September 1964 arrives with the weight of history pressing on its days. You walk through the capital as workers hammer together stages, soldiers polish their boots, and children practice waving tiny flags. The night before independence, Valletta glows under lantern light, the air filled with the scent of flowers and anticipation. Families gather in squares, talking late into the night about what tomorrow will bring. Some worry about the unknown. Will Malta thrive? Will Britain keep its promises? Others simply smile, whispering that after centuries of being ruled by others, Malta will finally rule itself. The morning of 21st September dawns bright and clear, the sky a deep Mediterranean blue. You stand among the crowd, pressed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of Maltese who have gathered to witness history. British soldiers stand at attention, their expressions solemn. Maltese officials dressed with quiet dignity prepare for the ceremony. The Union Jack, which has flown over the island for more than 160 years, ripples in the breeze for the last time. You hold your breath as it is lowered, the crowd silent except for the soft rustle of flags. Then slowly the Maltese flag rises, its red and white field crowned with the George Cross gleaming in the sun. Cheers erupt, echoing against the limestone walls, swelling like waves crashing onto the shore. At that moment, Malta is no longer a fortress for someone else's empire. It is a nation. You see tears streaming down faces, children lifted onto shoulders, priests raising their hands in blessing. The bells ring with a joy that shakes the sky, and even the British soldiers, for all their formalities, seem to nod with respect. Later that evening, fireworks bloom above the grand harbour, reflected in the calm water like stars falling to earth. Families gather on rooftops watching the colours explode their laughter, mingling with the distant hum of ships and the crackle of celebration. The island is alive, its voice no longer a whisper but a song. As the celebrations stretch into the night, you realise that independence is not an end, but a beginning. Malta now stands on its own, proud yet cautious, knowing that the road ahead will be full of challenges. But for now, the island basks in its moment of triumph, wrapped in the warmth of freedom, hard-won and deeply cherished. The empire's chains have fallen, and Malta has embraced the sky. The glow of fireworks fades, but the dawn of independence casts a new light on Malta. You walk through Valletta in the days after 21st September 1964, and the streets still hum with celebration, though now the excitement settles into something steadier: pride mixed with responsibility. The Union Jack is gone and the Maltese flag flutters alone, yet the British presence has not vanished overnight. Naval bases remain active, British officers still walk the docks, and the economy still leans heavily on military spending. Independence is real, but it comes with threads still tying the island to its former ruler. You wander into Parliament, where debates now carry a different weight. No longer are the laws written in London, they are forged here in the heart of Valletta. The new constitution establishes Malta as a constitutional monarchy under Queen Elizabeth II, represented by a Governor-General, while the nation begins to chart its own path within the Commonwealth. Some citizens see this arrangement as a sensible step, a bridge between dependency and full sovereignty. Others grumble that true independence should mean severing all ties. Historians still argue whether this compromise diluted the achievement or secured stability during a fragile transition, but as you listen to the discussions, you sense the pride in every voice. Malta is speaking for itself at last. George Borg, Olivier, the man who calmly negotiated this new chapter, governs with cautious optimism. He knows the economy is vulnerable, so he works to secure foreign investment, strengthen tourism, and modernize industries beyond the dockyards. The British bases continue to inject money, but they also cast a shadow of dependency. You overhear workers at the shipyard saying, "We need them, but we don't want to need them forever." It is a sentiment echoed across the island, gratitude for what Britain has provided, yet an eagerness to stand fully alone. Dom Mintoff, though not the architect of independence, remains a restless force in the background. His Labour Party criticises Olivier's policies, claiming that Malta's sovereignty must go beyond paper. Mintoff calls for cutting British ties more decisively and for building alliances that do not leave Malta at the mercy of any single power. His rhetoric grows sharper, and you sense that the political stage is set for future clashes. The island's path is no longer about breaking chains, it is about deciding which way to walk. You stroll past newly built hotels along the coast, their balconies gleaming in the sun. Tourism begins to rise, and with it a new economic lifeline. British holidaymakers arrive in droves, drawn by Malta's sun and history, spending pounds that fuel local businesses. Fishermen, once wary of foreigners, now sell their catches proudly to bustling seaside restaurants. Valletta, still scarred by war, slowly rebuilds itself into a city not only of history, but of opportunity. Yet modernization brings its own tensions: how to balance tradition with progress, how to grow without losing what makes Malta Maltese. The church, ever vigilant, continues to play a powerful role. You step into a cathedral where priests preach about morality and unity, reminding congregations that independence must not mean moral decay. Relations between church and state, once strained during the political battles of the 1950s, begin to heal, but the church keeps a close watch on every reform. Schools remain a focus of contention. Education, after all, shapes the soul of the nation. Meanwhile, the Cold War lingers in the background, its invisible lines running even across this small island. Britain's military presence is part of NATO's broader strategy, while the Soviet Union eyes Malta as a potential neutral ground. The superpowers watch as the island walks a tightrope between alliances. You overhear locals in cafes joking that Malta, so small it barely appears on world maps, now plays in the same arena as giants. The humor is light, but the truth is there Malta's location makes it a prize still, and how it navigates these pressures will define its future. Throughout 1965 and 1966, Malta settles into its new identity, proud yet cautious. Children grow up saluting a different flag, learning in schools that their homeland is no longer a colony, but a nation with a voice on the world stage. The older generation who lived through bombings and hardships watch with a mix of hope and worry, wondering if the sacrifices were enough to secure a better life for their descendants. You sit by the Grand Harbour at dusk where ships glide in under the fading sun. British warships still anchor here, but now they share the waters with vessels flying other flags. The breeze carries the sound of construction laughter and the steady hum of an island building its future. You realize that independence is not a single moment, but a journey, and Malta is only at the beginning of it. Change whispers through the streets like the wind through olive trees. The people are learning what it means to govern themselves, to argue, to build, to dream without asking permission. The battles ahead will not involve bombs or sieges, but choices, economic, political and cultural. And yet as the night settles in and the bells of Valletta ring out across the rooftops, you know one thing for certain: Malta has found its voice, and it will not be silenced again. The island stands small but unshaken, ready for the next step. The years after independence roll forward and you drift through Malta as it finds its rhythm as a young nation. The British bases still hum with activity, but their presence no longer defines the island. You notice how the Maltese government, now fully responsible for its decisions, begins to weave together policies that shape identity, economy, and international standing. There is an energy in the air, the sense of a people writing their own script after centuries of being cast in supporting roles. George Borg. Olivier's steady leadership guides the first years, securing Malta's place in the Commonwealth and building relations with European neighbours. Under his government, infrastructure improves, new schools rise, and tourism blossoms into an economic cornerstone. You walk past construction sites where hotels climb toward the sky cranes, swinging like metallic birds. Tourists spill out into the streets, snapping photos of fortresses and cathedrals that survived the bombs, leaving behind foreign currency and curious questions. The economy begins to shift from military dependence toward hospitality and services, a transformation that feels both promising and fragile. Dom Mintoff, never one to fade, quietly surges back into power in 1971 with a bold agenda. You find him again, speaking to crowds, his voice unwavering, as he declares that Malta must chart an even more independent path. Under his leadership, the island distances itself further from Britain, renegotiating defence agreements and demanding fairer financial terms. His policies turn Malta into a neutral, non-aligned state, a stance that fits the Cold War era like a glove. The British military presence winds down, and by 1979, with the closure of the last British bases, Malta completes its break from imperial dependency. The event is celebrated with fireworks and cheers, Freedom Day they call it. You stand among the crowd as the last British warship slips over the horizon, its silhouette shrinking against the blue, and feel the collective breath of a nation released. With neutrality enshrined in its policies, Malta carves a unique place on the world stage. It becomes a bridge between East and West, hosting international meetings, offering its harbours not as military outposts, but as diplomatic grounds. You attend a reception in Valletta where diplomats from rival nations clink glasses under the same roof, proof that this small island can hold big significance. Historians still debate whether Mintoff's policies were visionary or reckless, but they undeniably gave Malta a distinct voice during a turbulent era. At home, life continues to evolve. You stroll through fishing villages where boats painted with the traditional eye of Osiris bob gently in the water, unchanged by politics, and yet the conversations have shifted. People talk of jobs not tied to foreign militaries, of schools teaching in Maltese alongside English, of a future where their children can thrive without leaving the island. The church, once at the heart of fierce political clashes, continues to influence moral life, but no longer dominates every decision. The balance between faith, tradition, and modernity slowly settles into place. Through the 1980s and beyond, Malta continues to build new industries, stronger tourism, and a growing financial sector. You watch the island navigate its identity with care, honoring its deep-rooted traditions while embracing global connections. In 1987, the government signs an agreement with Italy guaranteeing Malta's neutrality and reinforcing its security. By the time the 21st century arrives, Malta has not only survived as a small state, but thrived, joining the European Union in 2004 and adopting the euro in 2008. You smile at how far this once colonized fortress has come, shaping its own destiny in a world far larger than the battles of the past. You pause on a high cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, the sea stretching endlessly before you. The wind smells of salt and wild thyme, and below, waves crash against the rocks with a rhythm older than history. Looking back, you trace the path from the Knights' crumbling power to the French occupation, from British rule to the bombs of World War II, from independence to neutrality and beyond. Each chapter has left its mark, but the island has always risen its spirit, unbroken. Today, Malta stands not as a pawn of empires, but as a proud nation, small yet resilient, a beacon of survival and self-determination. The Maltese flag still bears the George Cross, a reminder of courage in the darkest times, fluttering over harbours where ships of every flag now dock as guests, not masters. You hear laughter from a nearby cafe church, bells ringing in the distance, and the rustle of history blending with the present. As dusk falls, the sky blushes with orange and violet. Lights flicker across Valletta, golden against the stone. The calm is deep, but it is not the calm of submission. It is the calm of strength, hard-earned. You take one last look at the island bathed in twilight and feel its heartbeat steady and proud, a testament to centuries of struggle and triumph. The night wraps Malta in stars, and the story you have walked through fades into a soft whisper. This island, long coveted by empires, has finally embraced itself. The breeze slows the waves' hush, and the final chapter of your journey melts into quiet. Malta's independence story settles in your mind like the closing of a book, satisfying, peaceful, and glowing with meaning. The images of battles, rallies, and celebrations fade, replaced by the serene sound of the sea lapping against ancient stone. You feel the weight of history lifting, leaving only calm. You take a deep breath, letting it all go, and smile.